Hi, everybody. We'll take a few minutes to let people filter in. And while we're doing that, I'll share my screen so we can get a sense of the group that should be assembling around this idea. I'll put me and John in the middle here. We're kind of co-presenting this one about COVID testing. Hi, Pamela, good to see you again. It seems like this talk was sort of up your alley related to the app you were talking about during the larger session. Oh, and let me add Sparks as well. I don't know if we have any Sparks entered yet on this talk, but I'll get set up so that we can see them if any come in. No, no Sparks yet. Maybe one of the things we can do while we're waiting is just do a little bit of connectivity between the people that are here. So let's see, I'm looking at Tom and John. So Tom, you have public health statistics and public health informatics and strategic planning as things that you connected yourself to. I think these are concepts that are kind of at play in the work that John's doing around CIMIT and RADx. You want to give a little bit of background around your public health and strategic planning experience?
Yeah, did you get the right John? That was John.
Oh yeah, so that's, John doesn't have a ton of metadata connected to him, okay. But this is based on my knowledge, right? So here, intervention development, that might be the thing to think about, you know, how your experience might connect with the concept of intervention.
No problem. I thought you were pointing to John Luzier.
Oh, nope.
Right. No, I worked in public health for 10 years for the state of New Hampshire and was the chief of health statistics and public health statistics and informatics. And we did a lot of work kind of bringing in different data sets, hospital discharge data, vital records, behavioral risk surveys, things like that, and then creating reporting dashboards to help people see that data, like a lot of epidemiological outcomes. So in that, there was a lot of work that I did also around strategic planning with the Division of Public Health Services, just trying to help them visualize and see the strategic plan and to organize that information and show how different people's ideas ultimately bubbled up into things that other people rallied around and said that they all agreed that they're going to do the same thing. And when you have a hierarchy of ideas that people all agree with that align with actions that you're going to take, it's basically a strategic plan. And you know, and you can get some more quantification and stuff into that plan. So you know, there's good examples and stuff, but that's where that's where those two things come from. So public health informatics and strategic planning. So my background.
I always find it interesting when, you know, one of the concepts that we're discussing connects with somebody else in the virtual room, and you know, sometimes I like to talk about how we will sometimes use the same words for different things. You know, Tom just talked a little bit about his definition of strategic planning. Mitch, I know you have experience with strategic planning as well. How's your perspective similar or different to Tom's with regard to strategic planning?
Sure. You know, I think, and apologies, I mean, I'm trying to do a couple of different things here, so I didn't get everything that Tom mentioned. But I guess, you know, for me, strategic planning in a lot of cases in this day and age, we look at it kind of on cycles. So you hear a lot about the strategic planning cycle, and it's kind of a periodic, discrete effort, where I think some of kind of what you're working with Exaptive is how do you turn strategic planning just into more of the decision-making backbone for an adaptive entity, an adaptive organization, because these things are always kind of ongoing, underlying to the organizations themselves, right? People are having ideas, and what's happening with these ideas, and are they ultimately factoring into the strategic direction of the entity? So, at least in part, this discussion, which I am interested to be a part of, is, John, somewhat what you described, where, you're dealing with all of these potential projects and ideas and things coming from a lot of different people. How does that factor into an overall strategic direction for what you're trying to accomplish? So, I've seen the strategic planning done in a number of different organizations, but I always feel like it could be a little bit more formalized and integrated into how the organization operates as a whole.
Well, this is, Mitch, thanks. This is sort of a great segue over to John, because I think strategic planning is really at the heart of what he's trying to do with RADx. So maybe with that, John, I'll turn it over to you, and you can do things like we did in the last session, which is maybe just recap. Hopefully everyone's watched the video, but maybe just do a little bit of a recap of some of the high points. And then I think this topic of strategic planning that Mitch brought up would be great to get your thoughts on as well.
Great. Well, I wish we could talk about RADx as a great example of strategic planning, but it ain't. We often use the analogy that, everyone's kind of heard the analogy of fixing your plane while flying. Well, RADx, we were building our plane while falling. To kind of give you a context, obviously, COVID hit the world, and at the meantime, CIMIT was involved in managing a program for the NIH called POCTER, Point of Care Technology Research Network. We're a coordinating center, and there are 4 centers that are kind of doing the day-to-day work. One at Northwestern, one at Johns Hopkins, one at UMass Lowell, and one at Emory. And we had positioned to say, hey, there are a number of technologies that we were working on that could be repurposed to create some COVID tests. And again, depending on the situation, whether or not it's an at-home test or it's a test for an airport, obviously very different characteristics. So you need different type of tests. We weren't trying to come up with one silver bullet fits all. So as we're doing that, we agreed with the NIH that we're going to get a plus up, which was great. Our budget is around 10 million a year. So we're going to get a plus up, basically doubling our budget for an additional 20 million. And then all of a sudden, the NIH leadership had really recognized how poorly the country was doing relative to testing, and that really needed a complete restart. So they had formalized the idea of RADx, and actually I use RADx in the video broadly. There are a number of different RADx programs. We're managing the RADx Tech program. Another one, for example, is RADx for underserved populations, RADx Up. So there are a number of different ones. Our focus was on developing test methods that could detect the presence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus at all. And what that really was driving to was to be able to detect who is infected when you're asymptomatic. I think everyone knows the spread of asymptomatic patients accounts for, unclear what the number is, but it's a large fraction, 40%-ish or so. So we were told, I'm trying to remember the exact dates, but this was now happening probably around the March timeframe. And then in early April, we were told that, no, you don't have 20 million, you've got $500 million to spend. And this is the scale of what we're going to do. So basically what we had to do was to kind of put in place an infrastructure to be able to, let me back up for a second. One of the reasons that CIMIT was chosen was our history in being able to facilitate and support teams doing healthcare innovation. And I think many people recognize, the NIH is really great at developing science, but their mission in life is not to develop products and services. That's not what they're geared to do, and there shouldn't be. But a lot of the support that we're getting from the NIH is to help move teams that have great science and make them something that will actually help people. So our focus has been on innovation. We've been around for about 20 years. And we recognize that if you give more money to academic-based teams, you're going to get more academic research because they just don't understand the process of innovation in healthcare. So what we found is that if you facilitate teams before you give them funding, so you got the right resources together, they're working on the right problems, and then you provide facilitation with people that have been there and done that. So experienced entrepreneurs that don't just understand the technology, but understand the regulatory issues that you have to deal with, the workflow issues in a clinical environment, all of those things that could take a great science and turn it into a bad product or no product at all, and make it something that's real. So what we recognize, so we had a small team of about a dozen or so accelerator executives. And the question is, how do we now all of a sudden take what we've done at the small scale and do it at large scale? And frankly, when we did this, we had no idea what the scale would be. And over the first, I think we were thinking, all right, we'll probably get a few hundred applications because the timelines are tough. The whole goal was to deploy tests before the end of the year. And when we closed, we had almost 3,000 applications that were being processed, over 700 full applications that came in and were evaluated. So what we needed to do was to basically put in place a business. And we reached out to our community and said, hey, we're looking for experts, technical experts, clinical experts, regulatory experts, et cetera. And we were able to quickly, people kind of immediately saw the vision, put their hand up and said, yeah, I'm prepared to help. I'll put aside my startup and work on this for a while. We paid people. And we had over 500 people all of a sudden be assembled to support these projects. And you can well imagine, had we just kind of left it open without any kind of structure, that things would have been all over the map. We're very fortunate to have developed a platform we call GATES, for Guidance and Impact Tracking System, that basically, we believe that innovation in healthcare is a learnable, teachable process. We try to codify our 20 years of knowledge into that platform, which is pretty simple concepts at the end of the day. We use the technology readiness levels as an idea for maturity, but rather than just worrying about technology, for a commercial product, you got to worry about the market, you got to worry about the regulatory issues, you got to worry about the workflow issues, and basically design kind of how you go about doing that.
John, just a question for you.
Yeah.
When you put your hand up and said, hey, we need help from local experts, or we need help, and you said you got about 500 experts, was it mostly through networking through CIMIT? Did you do a formal call? How did you bring that network of people together? It
was networking. We did have an infrastructure in place to be able to accept those. So there was a link, people could sign up, add their resume so we could see and basically we had people sign up in a number of different capacities. They could say, hey, I don't have a lot of time, but I can be an evaluator, or, I can be a technical expert and solve a problem, or, I can join a team. So we basically had people be able to sign up in different ways, but it was primarily word of mouth. The nice thing is CIMIT's been around for enough that we, reaching out to the different startup incubators that we work with, academic centers, the reach was pretty broad, and we had the benefit of the 4 centers as well, and they helped with that outreach as well.
And did you have a structure of a team that you needed to fill in mind, or was it a little more organic where, when you started to collect, people in a sense, or build the team, you started to see the different areas where people could kind of contribute?
Yeah, so what we did was we basically constructed a framework where one of the key things that we knew is we needed somebody on our team that could be all over these projects. So what we're looking for is people with 20, 30 years of experience in diagnostics that have developed tests, that have been executives in companies. And fortunately, we were working with a group called C3I, or Biocom, and they were running a program called C3I, which is managed by Elias Caro, who was senior VP of the Coulter Foundation. And basically he had, through the C3I, had a network of about 30 or 40 executives that we could tap into. So we basically assigned them as a team lead. And then we said, well, senior people are going to need some support. So we had a portfolio manager, or excuse me, a project manager and an assistant project manager. The project manager typically kind of 10, 15, 20 years worth of product development experience, and the assistants typically kind of 2-3 years of experience. So that was a core team that would interface with the project team. And the project teams, of course, ranged everything from 2 people and their dog to Thermo Fisher. So some teams needed a lot of support and other teams didn't need much. But one of the things that we turned to Dave to do is, just to answer your question, as we're forming these teams, the team lead would be basically saying, no, we need help. We need an expert in this space or in that space. And how do you find those experts? Because we didn't know everybody, obviously. And hence the ability to tap into the capabilities that Dave has been able to show was a real plus.
Thanks.
I think one thing I'd add to what you described, John, that I think it's easy to sort of gloss over is, you said that you basically use networking to get that group of people in. But I think that the collab system that you put in place, like well prior to this, but the idea to have sort of a structured submission process is worth talking about, because we work with a lot of different organizations, and one of the things we see is that many of them have a submission system that's just based on email, and that it ends up hindering them when they just say to people, if you're interested, email us. And then they end up with all of this sort of, unstructured email threads that end up creating a lot of overhead in terms of them trying to sift through. So yeah, it might be, if Mitch is sort of interested in how you were able to assemble that group, I think, talking a little bit about what you saw years ago in terms of trying to streamline that process is actually an important component.
Yeah, that is a really good point. That the kind of the structure that we had, and in looking at these things, one of the first things we did, by the way, as we were expecting proposals to come in, is that we didn't have teams create their full work plan, which we would typically do. We basically had teams describe their technology. And we said, all right, in an ideal world, what do you anticipate your sensitivity to be, your specificity to be? So we would have structured fields to be able to quantify those things. And also we used our GACE platform to understand where they were in their development cycle. So there are a number of structured things that we're able to do to be able to quickly characterize projects. But of course, in addition to that, we had text fields, which we could separately query around specific questions. So that really is unstructured data that we would use in combination with the structured data. But the nice thing is, to Dave's point, we use this same framework. So Dave mentioned Collab, which is what we call it, because it had a number of iterations. It's built on a software platform called Open Water. And basically, it creates a single database. So as we were soliciting proposals, at the same time, we were using the exact same platform through a different channel to collect the individuals as experts and upload their CVs. So that gives obviously an opportunity for a platform like Exaptive to be able to use one database and query one database and help make matches. Not that it would have been impossible the other way, it just really streamlined things. But at today's point, I think one of the things that we have found over the years, the old joke, if you want better output out of a process, the best way to do that is to start with better input. So we have spent a fair amount of time to really trying to understand how we streamline the application process so that we can get teams in and then work with those teams to improve what they're doing in terms of teaming or their approach, and then make funding decisions in a more interactive basis.
Well, and that's one of the things that Dave and I have talked about previously, which I think is really interesting. When you're trying to, to get into innovation management, or how do you take this this mess of data and turn it into something is, you know, where are the places where you actually put some constraints? And so it's, you know, there's a balance between allowing people to just submit anything and everything versus, you know, having things extremely rigid, and where's that balance in between that allows people to provide enough data and enough information, but has enough constraints where it allows you to process it collectively. So it's you know, it's interesting that those decisions you made on where you place those constraints, which downstream allows you to more effectively, you know, process through that information.
Yeah, and we did explicitly try to keep the constraints on the type of solutions as broad as possible. But I think the nice thing is in being able to now look at that information in an informed way and to look at clusters of projects. What we can now do is kind of evaluate things in clusters and look at those characteristics to say, do we have too many in this cluster or not enough in another cluster, which we really wouldn't know kind of a priori. But once we've got these in, now we can start really looking at things from a portfolio management perspective. And frankly, there were some real surprises. So I'm glad that we didn't end up constraining things too much from a technology perspective. We basically said, you know, here are our criteria. And if you can come up with something, please give us your ideas.
I'm curious if other people on the call have some perspectives about some of the concepts that the conversation's brought up. I mean, there's been some discussion of team science and, you know, how you form the teams, or what sort of structure you might try and put in place for a team. There's been talk of innovation management and how applying certain constraints around the data you collect can help, but to John's point, you also don't want to overly constrain things. And I see, you know, Pamela and Bob on the call, and I, you know, Pamela, you were mentioning about data collection, so I wonder if there's any thoughts you have on constraints. And Bob, you're talking about reproducible research, so you might have thoughts about teams. Anything to throw into the mix?
I'll just pop in quickly and say that because we're still trying to solidify the questions that we want answered, we're not putting any constraints on the data that we're receiving. We're kind of just asking everyone to throw everything they have at us, just to make it easier to filter out what it is that we need or don't need, or maybe there is something we didn't realize was a common variable across the data that was being submitted. So kind of starting on the opposite end.
Mm-hmm. John, any thoughts on that? I mean, you've probably experimented through that spectrum of trying to catch everything you can versus ask a very targeted question. Yeah, I don't know. Any thoughts?
Yeah, and typically what we try to do is we try to stay broad, but we try to also kind of tell a story. So don't be prescriptive. Talk about what we're trying to solve and why. But then we tend to let things be pretty open because, again, we may be, we don't want to overly constrain things. But I did want to go back to one thing. One of the revelations that I had, I'm not a team scientist at all, but one of the things that we were seeing, kind of very interesting. Someone said, I need an expert that does X, Y, or Z, and that's kind of one dimension of what a person is, what a technical expert would be. And as I was looking at some of the work that Dave and his team were doing, it became clear to me that as we're starting to look for people, I would recognize as they were searching, I'll say John Smith or Sally Jones, and it kind of came to me. It's like, wait a minute, we don't need to say I need a technical expert. I need a Sally Smith. Because people know kind of when you look at that characteristic, this person has business experience, has some lab experience, whatever. You can't describe that. At least I couldn't at the time, versus looking at it and saying, find me someone like Sally Smith. That was a really neat way of kind of thinking about it, because people do that naturally. It's like, I'm looking for some help. Well, yeah, someone like Joe or Sally, but Exaptive was in a position to help us do that.
Yeah, I'll add a thought along those lines, John, because this is something, that I've found interesting to think about as well. And, kind of from the perspective of team science, which is that just like a particular person has, has a constellation of skills. And so I think that's kind of what you're getting at when you say I need a Sally Smith. What it's acting as a shorthand, not for just a single skill that you care about, but for some kind of weighting of multiple skills that you find to be particularly beneficial. And I think what's interesting about that is then to that is sort of fractal in nature. Like a team also has a constellation of skills. And so to be able to say, oh, you know what I need? I need another team like team R, because boy, they had the right combination of data science, the right combination of field experience, the right combination of production experience. And that sort of becomes a higher level Sally Smith, right? It's a team constellation. And so I'm really interested in this ability to build those kind of patterns at different levels. It might be at a level of a person, it might be at the level of a team, or it might actually apply to constellations of non-person things. So there might be a particular product that worked well, and it would be sort of interesting to think about it from a Sally Smith perspective. Why was that product so successful? It had a combination of ergonomics, price point, performance. And so we need more products like product A, for example. I think this idea of finding exemplars and then being able to understand what made them exemplary and sort of codify that so that you can then find other comparators. I just think that's a really powerful kind of workflow that is challenging. It hasn't been cracked yet, so I think it's a valuable problem to work on. I don't know if other people have thoughts on this. And Bob, you've been part of scientific teams, and you've probably worked with your version of Sally Smith's or Team R's. Any thoughts on this?
I think my thoughts are still forming here, so I'll put a spark in the city here in a while, and we'll go from there.
Okay, great. Natalie, thoughts based on what you're hearing?
Yeah, one thing I would contrast it with is, and we talked about this a little bit in the lit session, that some of the old or successful ways we had of doing natural language processing or ranking weren't particularly well suited for early phase ways to keep up with how important it was to know new results or new findings that pivoted, for example, how to position a patient or who to give aspirin to. Simple things that wouldn't come up as novel or wouldn't come up as having lots of reads were still the most important thing to know on the right day at the right time in the early phase. With team building, one of the things or tools that people use when they're dealing with the email or network submission type in-group thing you were describing, Dave, is they use Salesforce. And they use it to document how many contacts they had with so-and-so, and then what those outcomes were, and how those outcomes compared with the other contacts that the organization or individuals in it had with third parties. What John's talking about and Mitch is talking about is fitness to challenge, as opposed to who can I sell to or who can influence those I want to sell to. And those are a much different nature of challenge. And that's why I think that tools that are oriented primarily towards selling or influence, or to encapsulate that Reader's Digest style liking, those tools fail us in the face of public health emergency or civil unrest or many of the other challenges that we face, like natural disaster, where we have to act now with information on the ground that's rapidly changing. and we have a limited amount of people available to us to solve the problem now. And we want to get the best people available as quickly as possible who we know can work together.
Mm-hmm.
So there are multiple variables at play in what makes a good team, but we can tell from things like their GitHub history or a reference. Yeah, they complete stuff on time. Yeah, they work well with others. Yeah, their stuff usually makes it across the finish line and makes a difference. People we know that are difference makers might be carrying other characteristics beyond their H index or the dollar amount of grants they've received. And that might also inversely affect how available they are to you now for a new thing. So I love the way the graph helps us investigate that in new ways outside sort of the Salesforce view of people.
Yeah, this definitely is generating some thoughts for me, but before I chime in, I'll just see if anybody else, if it's generating thoughts for anybody else that they want to add.
Well, I'll throw out a hypothesis that I have, is that as you look at the collective experiences that a Sally Smith has, and then there's someone with similar, my bet is a lot of the intangibles that allowed Sally Smith to build those experiences would be similar to other people. And certainly what we have seen in team building is you just can't look at it on paper. You know, up until this point, we knew who team members were. It wasn't just reading a resume. You know, we had what we call site miners at all of our institutions that understood that, this researcher is really collaborative, great to get along with. So my hypothesis is that there's so much more about those similar people that got them to where they are, that their characteristics will be more similar. But that's a pure hypothesis on my part.
Well, there's something interesting there, John, that you just triggered for me, which is that, I mean, first of all, I just completely agree about the challenge of sort of dealing with the explicit versus implicit or hidden, information. I mean, even just looking at this graph, it's a good example. Like the connectivity that's being shown in this graph, which is then being used to facilitate parts of the conversation, is very much, limited based on what people entered and what aspects it knows about. And there's plenty of things that, we don't know about certain people, so we can't push it in a certain direction. However, the thing that you just made me think of is this idea that we might be able to kind of infer or assume certain intangible characteristics, some of those intangibles, based on the combination of the explicit data. So for example, going back to Sally Smith, what makes Sally Smith a person and not just like a single search result for a keyword is that she has a combination of skills. So let's say it's clinical experience, bench science experience, and public speaking experience. That's sort of the explicit data. But that constellation of three things doesn't always exist together, right? The number of people that sort of do bench science and stay in bench science and don't necessarily go into field work, that combination already tells you something. And the number of people that sort of have a science position but also do public speaking also tells you something about maybe sort of introversion or extroversion around that person. And so I find this to be sort of an interesting concept that, we need to take these subtle nuances into effect in team building, and they're hard to get at because we frequently don't have them explicitly in the data, but maybe we have them somewhat implicitly in the combinatorial explosion of the data. That's, I think, pretty interesting. I have another thought, but I don't want to hog. I don't know, the last couple of things were thought-provoking for me, but before I chime in again, I don't know if Tom or Mitch or Jared, I don't know, Jared, any thoughts for you on any of this?
Not off the top of my head. it's all really cool stuff. I've just kind of been watching and observing, but yeah, nothing really to contribute, just listening more than anything.
A little while ago, my head got stuck in this I'm like having flashbacks, which may be like PTSD from working for state government. I don't know. But I had a lot of ideas and mental models of what strategic planning meant to me and what we were trying to do. And as Dave knows, like I left the state because I was frustrated. And I gravitated towards Exaptive because I felt like Exaptive was working more at the root of the problem, which is about community development and building the tools to create like well-functioning communities of people who could self-mobilize in determining what the problems are to solve, and then help the government as a resource holder and resource kind of giver to more facilitate the good use of public money rather than control the good use of public money. So I think that the concept that we use, Dave, that I think about the most in the innovation model that we've been working on is Agile Co-Production, which is basically the pretty simple idea that, and I'll probably get this like really wrong, Dave could correct me. So if you're trying to sell widgets, right, and you're a door-to-door salesman, you have this outbound sales thing going on, and your sales are proportional to how many people you can visit to sell. And the big transformation for a lot of businesses is actually being able to convert to having inbound sales, where your effort can create like an exponential increase in the number of sales you get. And the same concept kind of applies to stakeholder engagement. And when you have to do a lot of outbound work to engage stakeholders in what you're doing, to understand what are the problems that my stakeholders are having, there's a lot of work in that, and you can't get very far very fast if you have to do all of that work yourself. And so what Agile Co-Production is basically this tipping point where you actually start to generate inbound stakeholder engagement. People who are coming to you to understand and seeing what you're doing because you're exposing what you're doing the right way so that stakeholders can find it, see it, understand it, and come to you to talk about how they see how they're going to integrate with you and move forward. And I think somewhere in this, and like where my head got stuck, has to do with strategic planning, and whether your strategic plans are about how to get more outbound stakeholder engagement happening more quickly, or whether it's about kind of making and trying to get to this conversion where there's just more inbound stakeholder engagement, which gets to this, like, I think that's the crux, Dave, of the combinatorial growth, is basically when you get the right inbound stakeholder engagement and the people kind of combinatorial looking around them as stakeholders and people who are trying to engage stakeholders, that you get the right growth in the right areas. And a strategic plan is about getting all that stakeholder engagement moving in the right direction, like towards the right goalposts, or just in a productive way. So I don't know if it's like particularly helpful to the detail that the conversation went into, but that's kind of where my head gets stuck in thinking about how to make that idea more actionable, the performance measures more easy to understand, and the benefits of that model and that kind of thing to shine a bit brighter, I guess. I don't know. So.
Your comment brought Mitch out of hiding. It might have generated a thought for him. Yeah, tell us what you're thinking.
Trying to do a couple of things, but yeah, no, I agree, Tom, but I guess part of the thing that I find interesting with that is again, traditionally, when you think strategic planning, it's a strategic planning process, right? And we do a review of our organization, and we figure out where we're at and what the external forces are and what the internal forces are. And we put a plan together, and maybe we have strategic initiatives, and it flows down into, tactical things, and then maybe into projects, right? And so it's this more discrete, cyclical or periodic effort, where I think part of what you're talking about is a bit of this state change where it becomes a decision-making process for the entity that we're a part of, right? And it becomes more adaptive. And while you still may have the framework of, strategic initiatives and tactical things and projects that you're trying to accomplish, that is continuously changing based on potentially some of that inbound input. Right now we have this thing, and this is kind of our general direction of the entity we're a part of, but we also have this process in place where this inbound input is consistently changing that direction. And so, you talk about a state change, and I think that when there's enough of that inbound input, and those who are giving the inbound input see the overall direction, the overall strategic direction of the entity changing, that continues to, it's like a positive return. It continues to, encourage more of that inbound input. But I think in a lot of entities, and probably what you experienced in the state, and I've experienced in the federal government and other entities, is you have people that want to contribute that inbound input, but once they see that inbound input doesn't go anywhere and it doesn't affect the strategic direction or the strategic direction of the entity, then all of those signals, all of that inbound input eventually dies, because I'm not going to keep submitting anything to this strategic direction if it never changes.
Yeah, and I have some very specific examples of that and what that results in for behaviors and shutting down the operations of like a public health community, when that entity, the strategic planning entity, basically stops listening and stops actually being responsive to the community. So
let me, a couple of things. One, I'm curious whether there's things in this that John sort of sees reflected in CIMIT and RADx, because it seems to me that there's elements like with RADx Tech, there's elements of both sides of what's been talked about. There's kind of an outbound element of the NIH saying, here's $500 million, we got to go solicit idea. It's sort of pounding the pavement to go get the technologies that we need. There's also this inbound perspective, which is, as you alluded to, like not trying to be overly prescriptive and sort of saying to the researchers, here's the broad goal, but you tell us what you think we need to do to achieve it. So I'm curious if you have thoughts about how those two things sort of coexist, and then maybe I'll bring it over to Natalie, who I noticed nodding a few points during the conversation as well.
Yeah, actually, I kind of look at, I think there's a slightly different opportunity or problem that this conversation has surfaced for me, which is, and one of the things that we've seen at CIMIT more than anything else is the old line goes, I'd rather have a good problem than a good solution. And too many researchers are really focused on their solution. One of the things that we teach as we work with teams is the requirement to go off and talk to stakeholders. And I thought Tom's description was really did kind of change my thinking a little bit, because it's a one-for-one. And are there ways that we can get more inbound input when someone says, I'm trying to solve the testing problem or whatever. Now within RADx, as I mentioned at the outset, we're not looking for a single technology test, right? Because the problems are very different. If I'm taking a test at home, I don't care probably if it's 20 minutes or half an hour. But how do I get information to the appropriate authorities? How do I know that this person is actually taking a test? If I'm taking a test to get into the Boston Garden, which no one's playing anymore, so no, I wouldn't do that. But clearly, I'm not going to wait 30 minutes. I've got to have this test in 30 seconds, and I'm willing at that point to have high sensitivity and low specificity. I don't know what you have, but you've got something that might be COVID. Go over here and now take the definitive test. So I guess where I'm going is what we've been trying to do is to get input from a typical. I mean, it's one thing to get input from clinical stakeholders on needs, but now we're trying to get input from school teachers, from sports authorities. People have never had to really think about these public health issues, and frankly, it's been a slog. And I really do wonder if we could figure out some way to turn it around to get much more inbound marketing on helping us understand, what is it that they need? What is their life really like? So anyway, that's what it stimulated in my mind, Tom.
I'm excited to hear the sort of connection being made. It makes me want to open up a Spark form right here. It feels like there's kind of a collaborative spark that's being made. So I'm gonna capture it, which is this idea of can we shift from an outbound model of stakeholder engagement to more of an inbound model. And I'll put as a description, and you guys can tell me if you think this is a good one. And then I noticed that Nafissa, which I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but welcome to joining our session. Maybe she'll have some input on this as well. But it seems like the traditional model of stakeholder engagement involves reaching out to stakeholders, but this is an outbound model that requires a lot of effort. Can we learn from how sales models have shifted to inbound it's really marketing. Marketing models have shifted to inbound marketing to develop.
This on co-production too. I think that's important.
Oh yeah. Thanks, Natalie. To develop better stakeholder engagement processes that are closer to Agile Co-Production. Yeah.
And a good example goes a long way. And this can be I think I've tried to explain this concept a couple of times and it never goes that great.
Try again.
It goes okay, it's just complicated, but a good example goes a long way. And man, I have a great example from injury prevention in public health about money gone awry and shutting down community engagement, stakeholder engagement, and leading to wasting money and no impact on public health interventions. And that's, I think it's just a good story, I think, to talk about like what the behaviors could have been in the community to help like public health understand that in a football analogy, that the public health department and the state government doesn't always need to be the one carrying the football down the field and setting the goal as to where they're going to carry it to. Like it can be more creative than that. It can be, there can be a lot more engagement going on in figuring out how you're gonna, or what you're gonna solve for a problem, and how the resources flow strategically, I think.
Yeah, the only thing I'd like to add, I think it's the same issues, but clearly, I think we're talking about two different contexts, I think, and I agree. So Tom's talking about a context where more or less you know who your stakeholders are. They're citizens of a town or whatever. And our problem oftentimes is we don't know who our stakeholders are. So we have to go off and figure out who really cares about this problem, who's dealing with it. But again, I see it as kind of the same problem, just in two different contexts.
Yeah, and we've run into that with some projects where now we're working to build some features into the cognitive city just to help our customers expose what they're doing for projects and the products that the community is producing, just so they can find out who their stakeholders are out there in the community, like who in the Ministry of Health is like listening, who's going to use these products, like who are the researchers, who are the radio stations that are going to talk about some of these stories and things like that are happening that they don't know who those people even are right now. It's as simple as getting a list of email addresses we found. So,
Yeah.
I guess a question, John, for you. You know, when you got all of these submissions, did it wind up being back and forth then? You know, you get submissions and then you have questions, collect more data from each of the individuals and update the records. And I mean, how iterative was that piece then leading into decision making, and how much of it were you also doing in parallel? So how much were you making decisions about certain things to go forward with while in parallel also working on developing some of the ideas further?
Yeah, well, we did something which is really atypical, and I got to give the NIH a lot of credit for kind of taking our lead. Is, you know, typically the process is you write a proposal, someone evaluates that proposal, and you get funding or you don't get funding. We said that's not going to work here. We can't get enough information in the proposal to know whether or not this is really going to work. We don't know if the team is really solid or not. So what we did is we basically had every application come in. We had a panel of experts evaluate these in fairly good depth. And a number of them, we said, all right, well, a number of them we could say, no, this does not fit the RADx mission at all, so put it aside. A number of them, we said, boy, these are really great ideas, but there's no way in God's green earth they're going to meet our timeline. And the NIH was very generous, saying, great, we're going to put those into what we call a redirect program to look at other funding for that where they weren't as time sensitive. But then the ones that we said, you know, this looks really good. What we did was then we put it into something we call the deep dive. So we took those teams of the team lead and the project managers and sat down over a week with the teams, and they filled out the Gates wheel to understand really where they were and what their work plan would be, and what was the long pole in the tent. What were some of the key issues that we would have to understand before we'd give them the larger dollars. And that would, and then we'd bring that to a panel and we'd say, here's what we think is required to really answer the question as to whether or not they should go forward. We call that work. So the first was a deep dive. Again, very intense week, ripping up their proposal, rewriting it to basically take advantage. I should have mentioned that, you know, things like testing, that the group down at Emory had a testing capability. The group at UMass Lowell was providing clinical trial support. So these teams didn't have to have everything themselves. We brought in a lot of additional resources. So for the teams that were selected for a deep dive, from that point forward, it was extremely interactive. In some cases, our team really kind of took over it and managed it when it was a group of academics. Others, obviously, with larger companies, it was more monitoring to make sure that they were on track. But that, as Dave mentioned, that Gates platform really provided that vehicle where we could have the interactions with hundreds of teams and have language which was consistent, so we can compare, you know, this project with another project. Without that, it would have been, you know, nearly impossible.
Yeah, and again, that's awesome, and that's an example of the constraints, right? You're constraining the language, as you mentioned, the ability to you know, compare these things across different submissions. It's pretty neat.
One of the things that we'll charter our colleagues at Exaptive to do is the data set that's been used so far was the proposal data set coming out of CoLab. So we had been building up the data in the Gates data set. But, you know, based on this conversation, I really do think that the information that we have, the signature that we have for these projects is much higher fidelity at this point than what was available in the proposal set. And I really like that idea of kind of looking at these signatures in like-minded projects and which ones were successful, what are signatures of successful ones versus unsuccessful ones. So I think there's a lot of really valuable information that we have yet to really mine out of what we have. So hopefully,
no, that's a second Spark before I've even submitted this first Spark. So I'll you know, let me be conscious of time. We're going to wrap up in a couple minutes, then we're going to take a little break before we get back together as a team. And it'll be interesting to see how the sparks from these different individual sessions start to, you know, see if they merge together in some interesting ways. Natalie, anything you want to add in terms of the discussion that I can capture?
Yeah, I think one thing that's hard in querying a graph database or information in a graph database about this sort of thing is one of the things the Gates platform does well, and that's de-risking a decision, right? You want to de-risk the decisions so that the time and the people, effort, and the money you spend are likely to find success if success is there to be found.
Right.
We can't express uncertainty very well in the graph because the node stands almost as a fact and the edge stands in relation to that. They simply exist without any measurement of veracity. I think a way of investigating how to query and represent uncertainty in a graph database environment would be really important to being able to use a graph database to express things like the measurement of risk or the notion of the uncertainty in results. And we're not good at that yet. I'd like to get better at that.
This is, I mean, this is a really cool, I'm going to turn off the share for a second. This is a really cool what just happened here, because from that one spark sort of that started with shifting from outbound to an inbound model, I feel like there's these two kind of derivative sparks that just got generated. You know, one is what John was talking about of coming up with a signature for a team using more signature data than just sort of unstructured proposal data, which I think kind of inspired by Mitch focusing on constraints being a good thing and not, you know, being able to be a good thing and not a bad thing because they create alignment. But then Natalie, you know, a second spark coming out of Natalie's observation that, well, sometimes in a graph, you know, you create some constraints so that you use a common vocabulary. Now you can get things to connect, but you can lose the fact that this thing is connected with 100% certainty and this thing's connected with 20% certainty. And, you know, and that generated a spark for me, which is there's a reason why, you know, in the way we implemented the Cognitive City, we're using a property graph as opposed to sort of a pure triple store. And that's because we want to be able to put a lot of rich metadata, both on the nodes and the edges. And then we want to use visualization to be able to, for example, layer opacity. So one of the things, you know, that I really like is when you're able to take a visual dimension like color or size or opacity, and you're able to layer it with a cognitive dimension in a way that really resonates. So I really like the way that opacity and certainty work together. So we, you know, we literally will say if something's uncertain, we'll say it's unclear, it's fuzzy, I can't really see it, right? And when we're certain of something, we say it's solid. And so when we're able to then take a graph and say, okay, this edge is very opaque, opacity is 100%, and this other edge is only 20% opaque, it becomes fuzzy and ephemeral. That's an area that I'm really interested in terms of being able to show uncertainty or being able to show error bars on an edge, for example, and say, okay, we think this edge has a width of 20, but it could be 3, it could be 30, right? And when I think about John and capacity planning, like production capability or de-risking, you know, to be able to say these are the risks, but which one's really the bottleneck? Can we identify that with edges in the graph? So I don't have time to enter those other two sparks right now. I'll do it during the break and I'll link it to this first one. So I'm appreciative of the rich conversation. I feel like we really generated a sort of co-created idea chain, and I'm excited to bring it back to the main group.
Okay.
Thanks for the attention. We'll take a 15-minute break, and then for those of you that are able to stay away from your regular jobs a bit longer, we'll come back together in the main group at past, and we'll look at the sort of aggregate ideas that have been generated. Talk to you in a bit.